After the voyages of discovery of Christopher Columbus and John Cabot in the 1490s, the next period in Canadian history is rather like a boat race, with the Western European nations competing with each other to see who will be first to take possession of the New World. Although to begin with, of course, the Europeans don't realize that this is a new world. They think that the territories Columbus and Cabot have discovered are islands on the fringe of Asia, what people used to call the Indies. But there is something that Columbus has come across that all the Europeans very much want to get their hands on.
When Columbus returned in triumph to Barcelona, gold. The Spanish monarchs were quick to emphasize their sovereignty over all the islands Columbus had discovered, along with all the gold therein. But their claims were immediately challenged, so there was a clash between the King of Spain and the King of Portugal, which brought up the whole question of how all the new regions of the world that were being discovered should be divided. To settle the matter, the Spanish and Portuguese rulers appealed to the Vatican in Rome, where the Pope in those days had tremendous power, including the right to share out among Catholic kings all newly discovered parts of the world. When the Pope, the Spaniard, Alexander VI, looked at the world as it was known to the Europeans in 1493, he saw something like this. The only parts of the Americas that might have been visible were the areas of Canada the Vikings had once colonized, which most Europeans had forgotten by now, and the islands in the Caribbean that Columbus had discovered. The Pope drew a line across the map, cutting the world in half and giving all the newly discovered or yet to be discovered lands west of the line to Spain, and everything to the east of the line to Portugal. The King of Portugal didn't think this division was fair, and after much negotiation at the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, the Pope's line was shifted about 1,200 kilometers to the west. If we look at how this line slices up the New World as we now know it, we can see that the only section of the Americas which falls to Portugal is the eastern part of what is now Brazil. Which is why today, Brazil is the only country in Latin America where the official language is Portuguese rather than Spanish. But this division was also to affect the subsequent history of Canada. Owing to the rather hazy geography of the time, when the Portuguese heard of John Cabot's discovery of what we believe to have been Newfoundland in 1497, they assumed that this was also on their side of the line, and therefore rightfully belonged to them. And so it was to Newfoundland that Portugal now turned her attention. For the next few decades, the history of Canada would essentially be the history of Newfoundland. How ironic that the last province to become part of Canada, when it joined Confederation in 1949, should have been the first region to enter the European phase of our history, beginning with the Vikings, then John Cabot, and then the Portuguese.
Because of the Pope's arbitrary division of the New World, the first two leaders in the race for its treasures are Spain and Portugal, with the lion's share going to Spain, leaving Brazil and Newfoundland to Portugal. But how did England fit into all this? After all, Newfoundland had been discovered in the first place by John Cabot on behalf of the English king. Now Portugal was laying claim to it.
Any potential argument between the rulers of England and Portugal about the land that had been claimed by John Cabot was settled almost at once, because England simply dropped out of the race, To see how this came about, we have to go back to Cabot's voyage of 1497. Unlike Columbus, Cabot failed to encounter any Indians. What is worse, he failed to find any gold or precious metals of any kind. But he was convinced that he had found an island off the northeast coast of Asia. So he returned to England to ask King Henry VII to help him mount a much larger expedition to make a more thorough exploration of what soon came to be called the New Found Land. The king gave Cabot enough money to put together a small fleet of 5 ships to go back to the New Found Land the following year, in 1498. Cabot set sail from Bristol with great pomp and ceremony. Then disaster struck. One of his ships was forced to put back into an Irish port in distress. The other 4 continued on their way across the Atlantic. And that is the last we ever hear of John Cabot and his ships. They all disappeared without a trace. For the time being, at least, the English king lost interest in sponsoring any further northern voyages of discovery. With England out of the running, the field was now clear for Portugal to launch her own series of expeditions to the east coast of Canada. The first Portuguese explorer we hear of is a man called Fernandes de Lavrador, which means farmer in Portuguese. Although the only part of North America Fernandes actually reached was Greenland around the year 1500, he was destined to stamp his name on the map of Canada. This is because, to commemorate his visit, Greenland was named Terra del Lavrador, the land of the farmer. Later, the word Labrador shifted sideways on the map and became Labrador, the name of the continental area of eastern Canada. Fernandes was followed a year later by another Portuguese adventurer, Corte Real, who explored the coast of Newfoundland. It was Corte Real who was to send back the first ever North Americans to Europe when he kidnapped some Indians from eastern Canada and shipped them back as slaves to Portugal. This period reflects this Portuguese influence, with Newfoundland labeled as Terra del Rei de Portugal, the land of the King of Portugal. The last of the major Portuguese explorers was a ship owner by the name of Fagundes, who sometime in the early 1520s set up a short-lived colony on Cape Breton Island. This was the first European settlement anywhere in North America since the Vikings. But sadly, we know very little about it, save that by 1526, the Portuguese, like the Vikings before them, had decided to abandon their colony, thereby ending Portugal's territorial ambitions in Canada.
By the early 1500s, when Portugal was starting to make a formal bid for Canada by promoting various expeditions here, quite a number of other Europeans were already visiting our shores for much more prosaic reasons. These people had no designs on the land itself, and they weren't after a quick route to the Orient or a treasure trove of gold. Instead, they were interested in something much less glamorous. They were out to harvest one of Canada's most abundant natural resources.
To discover what it was that attracted many of the first Europeans to Canada, and why this particular commodity was in such great demand in Europe some in the 14 and 1500s, meat was hard to come by, partly because cattle weren't raised on the huge scale they are today, and partly because of a rapid increase in population. Religion also played a role in this. Nowadays, many Catholics, as a small gesture of self-denial, still make an effort to abstain from meat on Fridays. But in 15th century Europe, everyone was Catholic, and there could be as many as 3 meatless days every week, not to mention Lent and other periods of abstinence. So this combination of a shortage of meat, population increase, and Catholicism meant that there was a tremendous demand for what had come to be the main source of protein in Europe, fish. A commodity which was much more abundant than meat and also relatively easy to preserve, either by drying the fish or by pickling them in salt. This was the natural resource which would lure so many Europeans to the east coast of Canada in the early 1500s. Because there is one particular stretch of Canadian water that is perhaps the most productive fishing ground anywhere on Earth. This is the area just to the south of Newfoundland, known as the Grand Banks. John Cabot is reported to have said in reference to the new lands that he had found, "The sea there is swarming with fish, which can be taken not only with the net, but in baskets let down with a stone." As soon as word of this got around, European fishermen started to flock to the Grand Banks. These were seasonal visitors only. They fished in summer and then went home for the winter. But we do know that by 1504, men from Bristol established a summer cod fishing station in Newfoundland on the site of what would one day become the city of St. John's. Shortly afterwards, there is evidence of French fishermen from Brittany in the area. Men from Normandy also started fishing here at a very early stage, as did Basque fishermen from both France and Spain. By the end of the century, many hundreds of such vessels were making regular trips to Newfoundland, and this fishing industry would flourish mightily right up until quite recent times. All this because John Cabot had gone in search of a northwest passage to Asia. He had failed to find the riches of the Orient. No silks or spices, or silver, or gold. Instead, Cabot had found something which was perhaps even more precious in the long run. He had discovered cod, the gray gold of Canada.
There are 2 parallel strands in the relations of Europe with Canada in the early 1500s. On the one hand, the informal visits of the fishermen, English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and Basque. On the other hand, the official voyages of discovery to the New World sponsored by the rulers of various European nations, Spain and Portugal in the south, and England and Portugal in the north, in Canada. And yet, the 2 official cultures of Canada today stem from England and France. When does France come into the picture? The French had been involved in the fisheries of Newfoundland from the very beginning, but so far we've seen no sign of France sponsoring any formal voyages of discovery to Canada or to anywhere in the New World. When did the French exploration of the Americas begin, and what motivated it?
That was the Chesapeake Bay. You can see the Chesapeake Bay, Potomac River there.
To understand what prompted France to undertake official voyages of discovery to the New World, we should compare the Europeans' perception of this world nearly 500 years ago with how we perceive it today. This is what the east coast of North America looks like from a space shuttle.
See Manhattan there. We'll go right on out the tip of Long Island. See the northern and southern shores out there, the Hamptons. And the next thing you see is...
We can actually see the contours of the coastline. We have no doubt that we are looking at a continent, and we could fly over South America in the same way to prove its existence as well. But at the end of the 1490s, the only regions of these 2 continents that Europeans knew of were Labrador and Newfoundland, and parts of Nova Scotia in the north, and portions of the Caribbean and South America in the south. But soon, more and more of these new lands were to emerge. In the year 1500, the Portuguese explorer Pedro Cabral discovered Brazil. And in the same year, the Italian Amerigo Vespucci, in the service of Spain, sailed down the coast of South America to become the first European to establish the existence of this continent. A few years later, a German map maker celebrated Amerigo's achievement by naming the new continent America. Then the Spaniard Ponce de Leon discovered Florida. And in 1520, the Portuguese Ferdinand Magellan finally discovered a route to the Pacific Ocean and thence to the Orient by sailing round the tip of South America. But there was still nothing to indicate the existence of a North American continent. It was assumed that there was a yawning gulf of ocean between Florida and Newfoundland. It was this gap which was to entice France into the New World sweepstakes. But in 1521, war broke out between France and Spain. King Francis I started to look for ways to cash in on this wealth himself. So, reasoning that Spain had had her Italian navigator, Cristoforo Colombo, and England her Giovanni Caboto, Francis I engaged an Italian navigator of his own, Giovanni Verrazzano. In 1524, Verrazzano started to explore the coastline of North America north of Florida, fully expecting at any moment to come across a sea passage linking the Atlantic with the Pacific. Instead, he found that the shoreline seemed to go on forever. Although there were compensations, the landscape that Verrazzano was sailing past was exceptionally lovely. In fact, he was so taken by the beauty of one particular stretch of coastline, roughly where the state of Virginia is today, that he named this region Arcadia, after an idyllic spot in ancient Greece that had become legendary for its cool springs and soft meadows and groves. Later, in the 1500s, the name Arcadia was to become Acadia and would shift northwards to the Canadian Maritimes. But although Verrazzano continued all the way up the coast as far as Newfoundland, he failed to discover an opening that would lead him to Asia. What he had discovered instead, of course, was the North American continent, just as Vespucci had discovered the South American continent. Vespucci's continent was now called New Spain. In the same way, the new continent which Verrazzano had found for France would from now on be labeled New France.
By the middle of the 1520s, all of the newly discovered regions of the New World had been claimed by the Europeans. North America, north of Florida, had gone to France, and Central and South America to Spain, except for Brazil, that is, which had gone to Portugal. England was now out of the running for the moment. Although all this while, fishermen from many different parts of Western Europe, including England, were reaping a magnificent harvest off the Atlantic coast of Canada. But while the Europeans were merrily writing their names across the map of the New World and helping themselves to its gold and its codfish, what were the native peoples doing? How did they react to all this?
The most surprising thing about the first large-scale encounters between the native peoples and the European expeditions to the New World seldom numbered more than a few hundred men. One of them, on a much smaller scale, the same applied to most of the early meetings between Europeans and the original inhabitants of what is now the United States and Canada. So that when they first caught sight of Europeans off the coast of the Americas, their immediate reaction was often like this one from the Micmac Indians of Nova Scotia. One day, we saw a floating island coming slowly toward us. This climbing in the branches. When the island came closer, we realized the natural assumption was that these must actually be gods disguised as men. They were also bursting with missionary zeal and were quite convinced of the superiority of Christianity over all other systems of belief.
Cuerpo no será quemado. Seré cristiano. Digo, te bautizo.
So, all of these factors, the unexpected arrival of the Europeans, their technological superiority, their supreme self-confidence, coupled with the diseases they brought with them, meant that most of the first encounters between people of the old world and people of the new were to leave the native peoples in a profound state of culture shock. A shock from which many of the first Canadians and Americans have never recovered.